Welcome to the Made for More podcast, a production of Emmanuel Schools and Summit Ministries. I'm Roger Erdvig.
And I'm Maggie Pope. We're so glad you're joining us for another episode. Today, we're talking about something that's very close to every Christian parent's heart, and that's helping our children grow a lasting and resilient faith.
Yeah, as parents, we all wonder, probably a lot of the time, am I doing enough?
Mm-hmm.
And what can I do to help my kids hold on to their faith? Not just during childhood, but literally through their whole lives. Like, what can we do today that will lay a great foundation and help our kids maintain their faith? And then you think of, navigating the world that they're growing up in today. How do we do that? So this is so relevant, I think, to us as parents.
Right. And I think it's the perfect time to be wrestling with it because it's summertime. It's a great season to be thinking about it. We don't want to fall into a summertime slump where we're just kind of zoning out. We want to really capitalize on the time that we have right now. Typically, summer just brings a slightly slower pace. Maybe we have more time at home with our kids, spending more time together on vacations. A lot of our kids are off to, church camps or VBS or just spending
Working
more time
their
with
first job, maybe.
Right. Or spending more time with friends. So it's a perfect time to be thinking about it, seizing the season and spending some time before the busyness of the school year starts to think about this big question. This is our big question for today. What are the meaningful things that I can do right now that will help my child walk out their faith later?
Yeah, and we talk about faith formation right alongside biblical worldview formation. I'll explain that in a minute, maybe in a way that will help us kind of see how they're related, but a little bit different. But in general, we know that research, that keeps coming out in the church world suggests that 50% or more of kids walk away from their faith and walk away from the church after they graduate from high school. Now, many of them do come back, but even of those that come back, they make a lot of really difficult and consequential decisions while they're away from the church, as opposed to doing it within the faith and within the church. But then most of them that walk away don't actually come back, even though there's that portion that do.
And, sometimes those statistics can startle us.
Yeah.
Some of that research can really make us feel uneasy. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is there's a lot of research out there that can encourage us and bolster us and help us to realize, okay, there's some common characteristics for young adults who stick with the faith, including, a commitment to being part of the church and some other things that we're going to talk through. And there's some very manageable, clear things that we can be doing as parents to help influence and to encourage them in their worldview formation and their overall faith formation in a way that is going to last.
Yeah. And that is the encouraging side. So there's like bad news, but there's good news. The bad news is the results of many kids walking away from the faith. The good news is there's actually things that we can do. Now, I want to just unpack just for a minute here this idea of worldview formation or a worldview and our faith. Like, how are those together? So when we talk about worldview, we're talking about how we see, interpret, and engage with the situations that we encounter every day. So our worldview is how we respond to, say, suffering, how we plan where our kids are going to go to college or support them in that process. Worldview is about what we're choosing to do on vacation this summer, and it impacts the decision we'll make about what sport they'll play in the fall, or if they're going to try out for the school play. Literally, our worldview is like this mosaic that guides how we see, interpret, and engage the situations that we face every day. It's a mosaic of what we love, what we know to be true, what we hold to be true, and what we always do. And altogether, that's kind of like our worldview.
Yeah, and I love that you're making the distinction for us all because I think when we think about faith formation and we hear those statistics about people walking away or young adults walking away from their faith, we tend to gravitate towards the things that we can do, like going to church. And again, not that that's not valuable. We think like, well, they didn't go to church or they didn't do this or they didn't do that. And it's usually actionable things that we can see. But what you're talking about when we talk about worldview is not just the things we do. but it's also the thoughts that we hold true and the habitual ways of our life that really shape us and shape our future steps.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you pull back out there, faith formation, we like to kind of characterize that as being formed into the likeness of Jesus. It's where our whole life takes on the character or the fragrance of
Mm-hmm.
Christ. And we compare that to worldview formation with kind of a simple two-part phrase or two-part sentence, so to speak. One is that faith formation is about looking like Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
whereas worldview formation is about seeing like Jesus. So the
Mm-hmm.
one is how we look to others and to God Himself. And worldview formation is this idea of seeing and kind of going external with what Christ has formed in us. So that's just kind of a way to look at those two concepts, which are so interrelated. And back to your original statement or question, Maggie, for me, it's okay, it's summertime. What can parents do to promote both their worldview and their faith formation so that they stick with living for Christ through the next years and then even into young adulthood?
Yeah. And so that brings us back to what we said about the research that's out there. And there's a lot of research, but I would just love for you to share just a really basic overview of your research and what you did that has to do with how a biblical worldview forms and how it's going to help us as parents who are parenting our students through kindergarten, through early middle school years, all the way up through high school.
Yeah. So I had this driving question to know how a biblical worldview, this idea of seeing, interpreting, and engaging the world, how does that actually take shape in a person? And so the approach I took to that was to look at young adults between the ages of 18 and 23 who others would say, boy, they are on fire. They have a strongly developing biblical worldview. They're sticking with their faith and their worldview after high school and in those critical years between 18 and 23, when the research says many of the young adults in the church walk away. So I looked at that group and said, what did they have in common? What were some of the things that they would all say, this was a rock solid part of who I am today? And so I examined all those things and put together this model of how worldview forms. And for today's conversation, there's really just two parts I think it would be helpful to talk through. One is that these young adults all had in common some very specific experiences from their childhood, and we'll unpack those. But then also, I discovered that the way they developed their biblical worldview was not simply by kind of sitting back and letting people dump content into their heads, but it was actually by engaging with life. And what we're going to say a number of times is processing their experiences. So, again, having experiences in life and then taking those back and kind of figuring out what they mean and how they should apply to their worldview formation. So I think it would be helpful, and we'll make some real practical applications of this, talking through those common past experiences that young adults with a strongly developing biblical worldview who maintain their faith, what are some of those experiences that they had as kids? And then how do they actually grow in their worldview? And I think we can make some really cool applications to parents. Maggie, why don't you start unpacking with some of those past influences?
Yeah, before we do, I just want to, you didn't say this, but I just want to point out the fact that what you're really telling us is the research that you did was kind of like those, maybe those organic moments that we've had as parents where we've looked at maybe an older couple or somebody whose kids who are a little bit older and they turned out like what we would think of as amazing. And we say,
Mm-hmm.
what did you do?
Yeah.
And this is essentially the result of you saying what was done with a big group of kids. So
Yes.
that's really exciting. And we're going to go through a lot of different things here, including those past influences that you mentioned. So there's a lot of information coming. But I would just encourage our Emmanuel parents, get out a pen and paper or take out your notes app, whatever it is that you do. And as we talk through things, we're going to give you some practical ways that you can tap into these areas of worldview formation. And when you hear one that you're like, hey, I can do that one, jot it down. Don't feel like you have to get everything
Yeah.
down
Yeah.
and do all of these things. But this is just going to give us a big overview of all those different areas. So let's jump into some of those past influences. And it's one that we actually mentioned already, which is church attendance. Because every single one of the young adults in your research was actively involved in church during their growing up years. And interestingly, that's even with those who didn't actually grow up in a Christian family.
Right.
That wasn't a prerequisite either for the study. You didn't say, I only want to talk to kids who were at church in youth group. It was just clearly emerged that, man, church involvement is critical.
Right. And that reminds me of some other research that we were actually reviewing recently in preparation for this podcast from a book called Sticky Faith. And in that book, they also talk about, and it's the idea of sticky faith. How do you make faith sticky so it lasts? When we think church involvement, what the research shows is that it's not just attending church, although that's huge. And it's not big, flashy programs that really make the difference. It's the relationships at church, like being a part of a church community. So when we say church involvement, we're not saying checklist church involvement. We're saying I go, I know people, they know me, I know kids at church, other kids know me at church.
Yeah, I think that that's just a really easy step for us as parents, right? Sometimes it's easy for us to get caught up in the busyness of our schedule. And maybe we're thinking, hey, I got to get in and get out. But really taking the time to let our students or yeah, our children form relationships with fellow believers, both their age and an older age, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, is key to just kind of soaking up that rich experience that's going to be mission critical when it comes to them holding on to their faith. But I just mentioned having those older, wiser individuals in their lives. Well, the second area of past experiences is the presence of a strong mentor in the lives of those young adults that you had a chance to talk to. That was just an important element in the background of their lives. And those mentors, they weren't just there like as the person that they would just go to, hey, I have a question, give me the answer, and I'm going to walk away. These are the type of people that was like life on life, helping kids grapple with the hard questions and experiences in their life as they went through them. And, sometimes as parents, we want that to only be us. We want them to only come to us, but we're going to give you some really practical action steps that you can do as a parent to feel more comfortable with this idea and really understand that this is so important for us to be thinking about for our children's lives.
Yeah, and it reminds me again, I'm going to go back to that Sticky Faith book because one church I attended several years ago, they were actually making sticky faith this concept, like the whole focus of the church. Like we're a church that is all about the kids. And so one Sunday morning, they introduced the idea of a 5-to-1 program. And my first thought was, oh, they're asking, and it was in the context of mentoring. So I thought, oh, they're asking every adult to look at 5 kids that they can pour their lives into it. I'm like, sign me up. That's really cool. But that wasn't what it was. It's really funny. It was the reverse. The sticky faith principle from that book is actually every one child needs 5 mentors. So it's not 5 kids to 1 mentor. It's 5 mentors to 1 kid. And it's this idea, and I think we can take that into our families and just ask this question. We're going to talk more about this one because it also falls under the category of how do we process our life experiences later in the model. But really, who can I gather around my kids to be their adult tribe that will support them, love them, and walk with them? So I love that one of mentorship. And I just thought it was really cool how that connects with sticky faith as well.
Yeah. And there's a little bit of a common theme because, the other area of influence that we know is so important is our family. So here we see other people, other typically adults, it's just really hard for us to separate ourselves and our identity from our family of origin. So our family has a profound and significant impact on our worldview.
Yeah. And as I think about that with parents, I'm reminded of a good friend of mine who he does a talk for parents. And basically he's encouraging parents to keep your family together. And he doesn't mean like hold on to your family, don't get divorced, although he certainly means that. but he also means just be together with your kids. And so he has this funny phrase that's kind of a riff on another phrase: the family that stays together stays together. And it's this idea that we as parents, part of the faith formation or worldview formation of our kids comes simply from living life together in the smallest unit of community, and that would be our family. And so when I think of practical action steps for parents, and I just think of all the many activities our kids to be involved with, I would suggest this summer, like try this out. Make a few decisions that prioritize family over other options. Like a family only outing in the midst of the many other things that are going on, or practice the discipline of just saying no to valid opportunities and stay home and be bored together, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes we feel like we've just got to be going on this fast paced, get out there and do everything. And I love when families do that with their kids and take them all kinds of different places. But there's just something to saying no, not explaining it, not having to defend it. Just say, no, we're actually staying home tonight.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm thinking as you're talking about that, Roger, though, that most likely there's somebody listening who's thinking, well, my family doesn't look like the typical nuclear family, that we live in a fallen world. Maybe there were things outside of my circumstances that there's the absence of a parent or extended family that is not present geographically or things like that. How do we think about the importance of family and what we can do if maybe we're a single parent or we're not located close to our biological family? What do we do with our kids to tap into this idea of family?
Yeah. I think maybe my first point or answer to that will be to the families that maybe are a little bit more like a traditional family. And I would encourage them to actually look for kids and, a single mom or a single dad and say, hey, would you come be a part of our activities? So, first look would be, hey, look for ways that you can pull others into your family.
Yeah, love
I think
that.
that's a biblical principle of placing the orphan in families. I'm using orphan in quotes there. And then for those that are in maybe a non-traditional family setup, a single mom, single dad, a grandparent raising
Mhm.
a kid, boy, don't go it alone. Make sure and church is a great place to find it, but also extended family is connecting with these broader families on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a great idea is, tap into maybe cousins that can be just like siblings, or I'm in Florida, which I think is still the South, right? But we often will have very close family friends that are referred to as aunts and uncles and
Yeah,
cousins
yeah.
without a biological connection. And I think really um, having the chance to think about who those family, in quotes, air quotes, family people that can be a part of your inner tribe would be an opportunity for those who are maybe walking through that without a typical structure.
It's funny you mentioned the aunt and uncle thing because that's not just a Southern thing, although maybe it is a Southern thing. I mean, I grew up in the Northeast, and there are still people that are my parents' age that I call aunt and uncle. And like, I kind of had to go through the chart with my wife when we first got married to know who was really an aunt and uncle and who was like not really, but
Right,
functioned in that role. So, yeah, I
right.
love that. This
Yep.
next one is a little bit more formalized, but all of the young adults in the study had some kind of training and education related to biblical worldview. And so this wasn't random. It wasn't haphazard. They might have gotten it in school if they happen to be in a Christian school.
Mhm.
But many times it was a part of their church, or where families would say, hey, I want my kids to understand more about this culture and how to see, engage, interpret and respond to it in positive ways. Where can I get help? And they would find things like a class in their church, or they'd teach a class in their church for other kids. Or they would send them to one of the worldview ministries like Impact 360, or of course, our favorite Summit summer conferences. But it's really about this one. I think the other ones are just more kind of the organic of life. This one is more like, okay, we as parents are going to make a decision to provide some kind of specific training for our kids in what a biblical worldview is and how to respond to the world around them.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned if, of course, we're talking to manual parents, but if there was somebody who was listening who maybe didn't have the benefit of the Christian school educating them specifically on worldview, there's so many resources out there
Yeah.
for families to tap
Yep.
into. But the other area that is related, and we often think about when we think about spiritual parts of our young adults' lives or our children's lives, is the spiritual experiences that they have. And this was consistent with the young adults in your research. They were able to look back upon those maybe benchmark moments in their walk of faith, significant spiritual experiences. That's things like, maybe their initial profession of faith, maybe their moment where they made a decision to be baptized, and some of those opportunities that they had to recommit and renew their faith. We see that a lot with teenagers. Maybe it's during, revival chapel, or maybe even VBS or camp, things like that. And so I think for parents, knowing that those spiritual experiences are things that young adults are looking back to and pointing to and saying, these were important for my formation. That these were kind of public moments where I stepped out and walked out my faith. That gives us opportunity to say, okay, so how can I make sure that they have these experiences? And right now is the time, right? VBS is
Summer.
going on everywhere. Look
Yeah.
for those opportunities to send your children to VBS or to church camp.
Yeah, and I would extend that just one other maybe related but a little bit different way. And you mentioned the idea of chapel services at Emmanuel, and other focuses on real spiritual renewal that I know Emmanuel provides for the students. And that's even to talk with your kids going into the school year about what kind of experiences do you think you're going to have this year that would relate to you growing in your faith as a young disciple? Now, you'd ask that a little differently for a kindergartner than you would for an 11th grader. But I know if your kids are going to Emmanuel or another Christian school, there's lots of opportunities for that. And you want to help prep them for that. Because again, the young adults in my study could look back and say, yeah, those were key experiences for me that propelled me forward.
Yep, that's great. So our last one is friendships. So we understand that our children, whether they're in early childhood or once they emerge, or if they're in those teen years, friendships can be a positive influence or can be a negative influence. And we often think of that maybe in more practical terms. Man, I can see how it is a positive influence in their life or negative, but it's actually also doing some work on their worldview. And that makes sense. So the friendships was a common theme that emerged when you talk to those young adults in your study, because the reality is we want to spend time with our friends. So what do we do as parents then when we want to think about how we can be intentional about the friendships that are being formed in our children's lives?
Yeah, and this one gets a little tricky because on the one hand, you want to really help your kids to develop positive friendships. The other side of that is we can actually cut them off from the friendships that they need to have in order to contribute to others. So I think there's a lot of gray zone in the middle of your friendships. Like you don't want to come up with this idea that, oh, my kids only need these perfect friends that are going to draw them to Jesus and be fantastic influences. But on the other hand, you also don't want to say, friendship, whatever, and just
Mhm.
kind of let it grow by itself. So we're talking about kind of getting into the middle there of, in general, helping your children to shepherd their friendships well. And sometimes that's going to mean really gravitating towards kids that are life-giving to them. And other times it's going to be serving other kids through friendship to be an influence. But the bottom line, again, from the study, as you mentioned, that friendships are so formative. So at the very least, we parents need to recognize that, and we've heard it said this way, that you kind of become the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with.
Right.
And so that's key. That doesn't mean all your friends have to be rock stars in the faith, so to speak. But in general, you want to be helping your kids gravitate towards friends that are life-giving, positive friendships. And then on the other side is talking to your kids about what it means to be a good friend and to identify traits that they find that are positive in others, and then try to emulate those traits. And that's really how friendship works, because so much of friendship is about role modeling. When I, as a friend, see someone else do something that I'm attracted to, I tend to want to be like that person. And so that's kind of the power of really good friendships. But bottom line, though, is to look for friends that are going to be positive, life-giving, and really encourage the nurturing of those friendships through play dates, through getting them together, through even taking them somewhere and dropping them off to be together when they're older and really being involved in that. But then also it's who can we pull into this friendship circle? And actually it's interesting, but when we have friends that require something of us as opposed to just give to us, it actually can help us grow. And that's actually part of the formation process, learning how to serve other friends that need us as well.
So good. So there are so many things that we can be thinking about this summer when it comes to crafting the types of experiences that positively contribute to biblical worldview formation, not just now, but having in that lasting faith for our children as they grow into adulthood and beyond. But there's a second component here that we would be completely remiss to leave out, and that is the processing of those experiences that they have. And this is something that you've probably heard Roger and I talk about before. The key to making meaning and to worldview formation is processing, and we want to dive into that. So we're actually going to talk about that, not next month, because next month's a little special, but the following month, come back where we are going to explore all the ways that we can practically think about encouraging the type of processing that's going to contribute to a lasting faith, and what we can do in our home in very practical ways to harness our everyday living for great worldview formation.
Yeah, so a way of looking at it is this was part 1, and in September, we'll be back with part 2 because next month, August, we're going to be introducing Emmanuel's theme for the year. So we're super excited about that one. So you'll have a month in between, but make sure you're back for us both in August and in September for part 2 of Faith and Worldview Formation That Lasts.
Hey, Emmanuel families. As we wrap up this episode, Roger and I are praying you are having a wonderful summer break filled with relaxation and intentional time with your family. We know that summer can also be a busy season, but it's also a great time to catch up on podcasts that you may have missed during the school year. We've had some amazing conversations with some friends and some familiar faces from Emmanuel, and we would encourage you, make a little bit of time this summer to catch up on those episodes. But we really pray that they'll be an encouragement to you, that they'll help equip you in your journey of ensuring that your children have a lasting faith. Made for More podcast is a production of Summit Ministries Center for Biblical Worldview Formation and Emmanuel Schools. Emmanuel exists to equip students to serve God and neighbor through mind, body, and soul based on a Christ-centered foundation. Join us next month on Made for More.